Tonight, we would like to discuss the common claim that a prophet is just another preacher. In every age, there have been men and women claiming prophetic gifts and supernatural experiences. Some of these have been true prophets, but most of them, as the Scripture reminds us again and again, have been false. To avoid the labor of distinguishing true from false, it has been the practice of historians simply to lump all such claimants together in a single class. To do this is to perpetrate a grave injustice against real prophets, just as to lump all professing healers together, as some people do, is a grave injustice to honest doctors. If there were only 3 real physicians in the world, it would still be unfair to put all doctors together in one category. And if there were only 3 honest prophets in history, it would be wrong to class all prophets together. For example, Christ has been charged by ancients and moderns alike with being just another traveling healer and wonder worker, a wandering wise man, a teacher of virtue, a thoroughly typical representative of the lunatic fringe. Generations of scholars have been quick to point the remarkable parallel between his wanderings, sufferings, and teachings and those of his near contemporary Apollonius of Tyana. The old traveling quack Peregrinus impressed the shrewd and discerning Lucian, middle of the 2nd century, as being a typical Christian disciple. At an early period, men began collecting stories and affidavits about Jesus' early life, showing him to be a simple country boy with an inordinate desire to impress people. The conscientious and intelligent Celsus publishes one of these accounts in all good faith. According to this version, Jesus made up the story about being born of a virgin because he was really ashamed of having been born in a miserable Jewish village to a poor working woman of the lowest classes. He says she was actually thrown out by her husband, to quote the authority now, a carpenter by trade, when he found out that she'd been guilty of adultery. Then he says, this is Celsus quoting his Jewish informant, since she had been kicked out, and that's the word he uses, she wandered around like a tramp and bore Jesus in disgrace. And he, having no means of support, went off to Egypt looking for work. There he became acquainted with certain skills on which the Egyptians pride themselves. As his adeptness in these increased, he began to get exalted ideas about himself, and ended up announcing that he was God, unquote. The same local authority can furnish specific data for this story. We even know the name of the soldier by whom Mary was pregnant. It was Panthera. And everybody is always admitting that the child was not Joseph's. This Celsus finds far more plausible than any far-fetched tales about virgin birth. The whole thing seems to ring true to him, as he puts it. And he easily accounts for all the events that otherwise would have to be explained by miracles. And we must admit that Celsus has a point. The low-class origin, the poverty, the loose morals, the odd jobs, the magic and hocus-pocus, the mounting ambition, the supernatural claims, they're all very plausible. They're the sort of thing that happens. One could furnish many parallels from the world in which Jesus lived. Ever since Celsus, men have seized upon superficial resemblances of Christ to other men, religious men of his age, to prove that he was simply one of many. That makes him easy to explain. By diligent search, one can match all his teachings by the teachings of others. The earliest apologists actually used to do that, and they used to ask the pagans, why do you persecute us when we teach only what you do? Christ was a homeless man followed about by disciples. So were the traveling sophists. He was a great moral teacher. So were they. He was persecuted and reviled. So were the Stoics and Pythagoreans. His followers claimed that he was the Messiah. So did the followers of Bar Kokhba and Bar Nephili. He was crucified, so was Mani and many another religious fanatic. Even his resurrection easily suggests the victory over death in year drama rituals of many Oriental people. And when the king emerges from the underworld after having been overwhelmed in combat with death, usually after 3 days, Hugo Gressman first pointed out, many have since. All these things have been pointed out repeatedly in order to bring Christ down to the level of everyday experience and supplant the miraculous and embarrassing by the commonplace and reassuring. But all to no avail. One does not compose music with a slide rule, and the divinity and truthfulness of Christ were never meant to be proven by history, since we are told from the beginning that knowledge comes only by direct revelation from the Father in heaven, knowledge of the divinity of Christ, and in no other way. But even on historic grounds, the accidental resemblances between the Lord and other teachers are superficial and trivial. They may be striking, but they are that, compared with the great fundamental differences between them. There's a huge classic literature dealing with the activities of the traveling wise men and religious teachers in late antiquity. These men all had certain well-marked characteristics. They wandered after the manner of the 7 wise men, unattached through the world as spectators of God's works. Christ always stayed within a few miles of home and never evinced any interest in natural philosophy. They were all seekers after wisdom. Christ had it to give. They lived in complete detachment from society and were tolerated by rulers and governments as harmless dreamers. His organizing activities alarmed Roman and Jewish authorities alike, and his movement was always regarded as a dangerous one. They emancipated themselves from family and friends. He lived intimately with them all his days. They performed interesting experiments and theatrical tricks to delight and impress the multitude. His miracles were all useful ones, never meant to be eye-catching. They attended the schools of others and sought to sit at the feet of the great teachers, especially in very distant countries. He spoke as one having authority and never sought out men in distant countries. They did everything to attract the largest possible following. He forbade his disciples to do what would make them popular. They gained or lost students as disciples chose to follow or to leave them. He chose his own disciples and bound them to him by bonds and covenants. They all, as Professor Yeager has shown, gave political counsel and advice, seeking official and advisory positions with governments and corresponding widely with officials everywhere. He gave no such advice and wrote no such letters. The only proper place for them to deliver their discourses was in the theater, at set dates, incidentally, the official assembly time and place. He always avoided holding forth in such places. They cultivated peculiarities of dress and appearance. His disciples were criticized for not doing so. We could go on, but the point is clear. In all essentials, Christ was the very opposite to the men with whom he is classed. In a word, he was a true prophet and they were not. If they sometimes resemble him, and strikingly, it's because of their own efforts to resemble him, making a noise like a true prophet. The great difference is that they were only looking for what Christ had. They spoke as scribes and Pharisees, as hypocrites, he as one having authority. There is all the difference in the world between the two. Amid a host of like-minded seekers, many of them devout and honest men, one alone was not a seeker. Bearing this in mind, let us turn to the criticism of our modern prophets, especially of Joseph Smith. I am sure as we read Seltz's official account of Jesus, most of our hearers thought of the usual Gentile stories of Joseph Smith. More familiar even than the sly, sordid details and the air of superior knowledge and sophistication in the teller is the characteristic insinuation that Jesus and his family were not really the sort of people with whom respectable men and women associate. This tone runs all through the early anti-Christian as it does through the early anti-Mormon literature. Men have not been slow to point out superficial resemblances of the modern prophet to other men around him. He founded a church, so did other men. He claimed revelation from heaven, so did they. He was persecuted, so were they. He read the Bible, so did they. Since they were impostors, so accordingly was he. This last is what we cannot say. One might build up an endless list of resemblances between Joseph Smith and Gladstone, but what would it prove? Say that they were both men. What we must ask in case of the modern prophet, as of every prophet, is what we must ask in the case of Jesus. Where was he essentially different from all the rest? On this question, one man's opinion deserves particular attention, and that's Edward Meyer. He was one of the learnedest men of modern times. Ancient history was his field, and the origin of religions was his special interest. He wrote authoritative works on the origin of Christianity, of Islam, and of the Mormons. And why these three? Well, he explains, because they are the only documented instance of religion that had actually had a beginning. All other churches, he notes, and all other sects are really only episodes in the history of a going concern, variations on an accepted theme of world religion, reforms or innovations undertaken by men who, though they may feel aware of a special calling or a special talent for the job, are simply doing what other men do. But these three religions actually claim to have been founded not by men, but by direct revelation from heaven. Meyer finds that the closest resemblance is between the Mormon Church and the primitive Christians, whom they resemble in every detail, he says, even to their defects. He also finds resemblances between Joseph Smith and Muhammad, but these are superficial and incidental compared with the essential points on which the two men, both claiming to be prophets, stand in complete antithesis to each other. And these are important. Since it's long been a popular indoor sport among the Gentiles to compare Joseph Smith to Muhammad, I don't think it'll be amiss at this time to list a few points of difference between the two, as observed by one of the few scholars, perhaps the only one, who ever had a first-hand knowledge of both Mormons and Mohammedans. First of all, Edward Meyer dwells at considerable length on the doubts and misgivings that so long beset Mohammed. His long periods of self-mistrust and black despair, especially that period known as the Fatra, when he meditated and, according to some sources, even attempted suicide. For the Prophet of Islam, being an honest man, was greatly worried over the possibility that he might be crazy. He worried a lot. Or that he might have seen the devil and not an angel at all. He worried himself sick about that for years. In contrast to this, says Meyer, and I quote, "It is for Joseph Smith very significant that there is in his case absolutely no question of any such doubts and misgivings." Unquote. Meyer congratulates Mohammed for having the normal human reaction and chides Joseph Smith for not having it. Secondly, in contrast to Joseph Smith's behavior, Meyer holds up the exemplary caution, restraint, and shrewdness of Mohammed, showing how he gained confidence with practice through the years, carefully worked out his doctrine and his story, correcting, revising, and building it up. Unlike Joseph Smith or the Old Testament prophets, he says, Mohammed never actually sees anything in his revelations, but he reads slowly and very painfully from a book, but he never sees anything. Smith finds himself in company with the ancient prophets of Israel here. Mohammed does not. Thirdly, the most important difference between the two purported prophets, according to Edward Meyer, is that Joseph Smith, and I'm quoting, has a belief in the continuation of direct prophetic inspiration, speaking in tongues and so forth, and along with that, a personal inspiration which every believer can receive. Mohammed, on the other hand, knows of only one single book, and that is the Bible, and he only has a very vague acquaintance with it. Fourthly, Joseph Smith views spiritual and supernatural things much more crassly and materially, as Edward Meyer puts it, than does Mohammed. For him, the manifestations of the other world are something quite real and matter of fact. Then we're quoting, "For Mohammed, on the other hand, there is only one miracle, the revelation of the words of the divine book and the appearance of angels. He denied any power to do miracles, and his followers have no special power of any kind." Modern Mohammedans, among whom I count many of my friends, rather pride themselves on their cool and rational attitude toward all otherworldly things. In the fifth place, the most obvious point of resemblance between these two men is their common claim to have given the world a revealed book. But precisely on this point, Meyer finds the completest, if not the most important, difference between them. After all, hundreds of men have claimed to have given inspired writings to the world. There's nothing in the mere claim to justify or condemn a prophet. But Smith's book is like no other book. Whereas, says Meyer, for Mohammed, the book always remains in the hand of an angel, Smith himself not only read it, but translated his book, which he carried around with him from place to place. He actually copied out characters of the book and circulated them all around, including to his worst enemies, to look at and to examine. Has any impostor ever displayed such absolute confidence in his work? Any such thing, says Meyer, would never have occurred to Mohammed. Mohammed's accounts of heavenly visitors are vague and conflicting. Usually his visions came in sleep. He looks above him and he sees something in the air, or he sees Gabriel standing on the horizon, or filling the sky with his gigantic size, or confronting him whichever way he turns his head, or standing a bowshot away. There is a dreamlike quality in it all. Smith's reports, on the other hand, are clear, specific, and precise. My own great-grandfather was a Jew, and a very hard-headed and practical man. He tells in his journal, writing on the very day that the event took place, of how he cross-examined Joseph Smith on every minute detail of the first vision, and of how the prophet satisfied him promptly and completely. From that day, he never doubted the calling of the prophet. Apparently, Mohammed is not exactly sure of just what an angel is. But what could be more clear and concrete than Joseph Smith's description of Moroni? Well, Edward Meyer's final conclusion is that Mohammed's revelations stand higher than those of Joseph Smith's, because in his case we feel, and I'm quoting, something of the power of a conviction wrung out by hard mental toil, and even at times we feel something of a poetic inspiration, unquote. Of this, not the minutest trace in Joseph Smith. Meyer can respect the mental effort of the founder of Islam, wrestling with his human limitations, but Joseph Smith remains an enigma. He has no patience with this upstart who never doubts in the face of the most appalling persecution, and amid all his terrible trials and struggles, never struggles for inspiration. Meyer's impatience with Joseph Smith is actually a strong witness to his prophetic calling, for he treats Ezekiel in exactly the same way in the Geschichte des Altertums. Of this great prophet, he says, the prophetic apparatus has sunk to the lowest literal forms. Ezekiel is a literary hack worker. He doesn't work through the living word, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah struggled to bring out of the depths of the soul, but simply reels off the contents of a book which he's supposed to have swallowed in a vision. Ezekiel is narrow-minded, cramped, without sweep or power, devoid of any creative imagination, fantasie, and hence marked by unendurable pedantry and monotony. Here we have an interesting test. Meyer likes and understands Muhammad, who, though a remarkable man to say the least, is, after all, just a man who reacts just as one would react, or expect any normal man to react, if he were trying to work himself into a state of religious conviction. The vagueness, the mystery, the struggle, the doubt, every religious leader experiences them, and we have all some idea of what Muhammad went through. He is, so to speak, just another preacher, though a great one. But not so Joseph Smith. Meyer finds him, like Ezekiel, crass, literal, unpoetic, devoid of the power of fantasy, I love that, unmoved by doubts, unennobled by despairing struggles. Here are men that cannot by any effort be fitted into Meyer's catalog of religious thinkers. If the nature of his prophetic claim placed him completely apart from all the other religious men of his day, it also disqualified Joseph Smith for classification with any other type of prophet than represented by Ezekiel, Christ, and the ancient apostles. However much he may have resembled other men in other things, when it came to his prophetic calling, Joseph Smith was not a Mohammed, struggling to convince himself and find poetic expression. He was not a scholar of divinity seeking to unriddle the scriptures for his less educated or less inspired fellows, and certainly he was not just another preacher. He was a true prophet of God.